The train whistle screamed a final, mournful note, a sound that was swallowed whole by the vast, iron-gray sky pressing down on the Dakota plains. It was a sky that promised nothing but more cold, more snow, more silence. On the splintered planks of the platform, May stood alone, a single, slender figure in a traditional silk cheong sam the color of winter dusk. The garment, meant for a temperate southern climate and a celebrated arrival, was a cruel joke in this place. The wind, sharp and full of teeth, clawed through the thin fabric, raising goose flesh on her arms and turning her bare feet, resting on the frost-rimed wood, into blocks of aching ice. Her husband-to-be, the man whose letters had promised a new life, had not been there. His brother, a man with a sour face and shifty eyes, had taken her single trunk, pointed to the bench, and said, "Wait here." Then he had boarded the departing train without a backward glance. She was not a bride. She was luggage, forgotten at the final stop. The few townspeople scattered nearby stared, their faces pinched and curious. They looked at her delicate shoes, now sitting uselessly beside her on the bench, and her bare feet, a testament to a desperate, last-minute decision to trade them for a stale loaf of bread on the long journey. They saw a porcelain doll, breakable and useless, abandoned in a world of mud and muscle. Humiliation burned in her throat, a hot, suffocating poison that was somehow colder than the air she breathed. Loneliness was no longer an emotion. It was the landscape itself, stark, endless, and utterly indifferent to her survival. Every tick of the station clock was a hammer blow, driving the nail of her predicament deeper into her heart. She was 23 years old, an ocean away from everything she had ever known, and she was utterly, terrifyingly without a person in the world. A man detached himself from the shadows of the livery stable across the dusty, frozen street. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but he moved with a hesitation that made him seem smaller, as if he were trying to apologize for the space he occupied. He wore a worn sheepskin coat and a hat pulled low, hiding his face. In his raw, chapped hand, he clutched a small, clumsy bouquet of prairie wildflowers, their purple and yellow heads already wilting from the brutal cold. It was the most beautiful and pathetic thing May had ever seen. He approached the platform slowly, his boots crunching on the hardened earth, and the whispers of the onlookers turned from idle gossip to focused speculation. He stopped before her, keeping a respectful distance, and finally lifted his head. His eyes were a startlingly gentle blue, filled with a deep, aching shyness. He didn't look at her like she was a curiosity or a problem. He looked at her as if he understood the crushing weight of being judged. He held out the flowers. "For you, miss." His voice was low and rough, unused to public speech. May stared at the offering, then at his face, searching for the trick, the angle, the hidden cruelty. There was none. There was only a profound and solemn earnestness. He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to the frozen planks between them. "My name is Thomas. I saw what happened." The words hung in the air, a simple statement of fact that carried no pity, only witness. He took a breath, a plume of white vapor ghosting from his lips. "I have a ranch. It's quiet, but it's warm." He paused, the silence stretching until it was almost unbearable. Then he whispered the words that would change everything, a question so direct and so absurd it seemed to bend reality around it. "Can you be my wife forever?" The journey to his homestead was a silent procession through a world bleached of color. May sat beside him on the wagon bench, her single trunk behind them, the wilting flowers clutched in her lap. She had said yes. It was not a word of love, or even of hope, but of pure animal survival. Yes was a roof. Yes was a fire. Yes was a shield from the leering eyes in the town. Thomas's ranch was nestled in a shallow valley. A small, dark cabin and a sturdy-looking barn hunkered down against the encroaching winter, looking like two lonely animals braced against a predator. The place was stark, functional, and deeply, achingly masculine. Inside, the cabin was a testament to a life lived without a woman's touch, but not one of squalor. It was the organized disarray of a man who worked from sunup to sundown and collapsed into sleep. Tools lay on the table. A pile of mending sat beside the cold hearth, with a needle still stuck in a torn shirt, and a thin layer of dust coated every surface that wasn't in daily use. He built a fire with practiced, efficient movements, his large hands surprisingly deft. He offered her the only chair while he stood by the hearth, a stranger in his own home. "It isn't much," he said, the words an apology. May looked not at the dust or the clutter, but at the way the chimney was soundly built, the way the windows were sealed tight against the drafts. She saw work. She saw competence. She rose, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and walked to the pile of mending. She picked up the shirt, her fingers tracing the ragged tear. Without a word, she found the tin of sewing supplies, threaded the needle with an expert flick of her wrist, and began to stitch. Her stitches were tiny, perfect, and brutally efficient. They were not the decorative embroidery of a lady. They were the practical, reinforcing work of someone who knew the value of a garment and the cost of waste. Thomas watched, mesmerized. He had expected tears, complaints, perhaps a fragile collapse. He had not expected this quiet, immediate industry. "I can work," she said, her voice soft but firm, her eyes never leaving her task. "I am not a doll to be put on a shelf. This is a partnership, or it is nothing." He simply nodded, his assumption of her helplessness shattering like a pane of ice. The days fell into a quiet, rhythmic pattern, a silent language of shared labor spoken in a house of strangers. Their lives began to braid together not through conversation, but through action. May rose before him, the cabin already filled with the smell of coffee and baking biscuits when he came in from the barn, his face red from the cold. She had taken the chaotic pantry and transformed it, organizing the meager supplies with a ruthless logic that seemed to create food where there had been none. She repaired his worn clothes until they looked stronger than when they were new. She found a rhythm in the harsh landscape, her initial fragility revealing a core of resilient steel. She learned the particular groan of the floorboards that meant the wind had shifted north, the subtle change in the light that promised more snow. In return, Thomas showed his own steady competence. He was a man who understood the earth, the animals, the tyranny of the seasons. He moved with a purpose that was as natural as a river flowing to the sea. He never wasted a motion, never wasted a resource. He chopped wood with a powerful, hypnotic rhythm, tended to his few cattle with a gentle authority, and navigated the snow-covered land as if he could read its secrets. One evening she found a pair of soft deerskin boots by the hearth, roughly made but lined with warm fleece. There was no note, no grand gesture. They were simply there. She looked at him, her eyes questioning, and he just shrugged, his face flushing as he turned his attention to sharpening a knife. "Your feet," he mumbled. "They can't be cold." It was the most intimate thing he had ever said. The small warmth in the cabin grew, a fragile flame cupped against the howling wilderness outside. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a deep, grounding respect, a recognition of another soul's ability to endure. It was a partnership. The first test of their fragile union arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a stout, red-faced man on a fat horse. He was Mr. Gable, the town's banker and chief busybody, a man whose piety was matched only by his predatory instincts. He dismounted without being invited, his eyes sweeping over the small ranch with a look of open disdain before landing on May, who was sweeping snow from the porch steps. His lip curled into a smile that held no warmth, only a greasy sort of pity. "Well now, Thomas," he boomed, ignoring May entirely as Thomas came out of the barn, his expression guarded. Heard you picked up some exotic cargo from the station. Didn't figure you for the type." The insult was clear, labeling her as something bought, something foreign and subhuman. Thomas's hands clenched into fists at his sides, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He looked like a man about to charge, but words failed him, his shyness a locked cage around his outrage. May stopped sweeping. She stood perfectly still, the broom held in her hands like a staff of office. She looked directly at Mr. Gable, her gaze level and cold as a frozen lake. "You are mistaken, sir," she said, her English precise and clear, with no trace of the broken accent he likely expected. "My husband did not pick up cargo. He offered a partnership." She took a step forward, her presence suddenly filling the entire porch. "And this partnership is a private one. If you are here to discuss the loan, Thomas and I have reviewed the account. The payment will be made on Friday, as per the agreement. If you are here for social reasons, we are not receiving guests." Mr. Gable's jaw went slack. He had come expecting to intimidate a shy bachelor and mock his strange mail-order bride. He did not expect to be addressed with the cool authority of a bank manager by a woman in a gray silk dress. He sputtered, turning to Thomas for support, but Thomas simply stood straighter, a slow tide of pride washing over his face. He found his voice, quiet but unshakable. "She is right," he said. "Come back on Friday." Gable, flustered and defeated, mounted his horse and rode away, casting one last, bewildered look at the woman on the porch who refused to be humiliated. When he was gone, Thomas looked at May, his blue eyes full of a new and profound admiration. For the first time, he saw not just a survivor, but a queen. That night, the air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken things. The confrontation with Gable had changed the shape of the silence between them. It was no longer a space of caution, but one of shared victory. By the flickering lamplight, May knelt before her trunk for the first time since her arrival. She lifted the lid, releasing the scent of sandalwood and home. Inside, nestled amongst folded silks, was a small, lacquered box. Thomas watched from the table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, his quietness a form of respect. She drew out a set of exquisitely made calligraphy brushes and a worn inkstone. "My father was a scholar," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "He taught me that a person's worth is written in their character, not their circumstance. He saved for years to send me to a better life." She traced the smooth handle of a brush. "The man I was supposed to marry, his letters were like poetry. He wrote of respect, of a new world. But his brother saw only a bill of lading, a debt." The humiliation was there again, but this time it wasn't a fire in her throat. It was a cold, hard stone in her memory. She looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "I was to be a wife of status. Instead, I became a beggar on a train platform." Thomas set his mug down with a quiet thud. He walked to the mantelpiece and took down a small, faded photograph in a simple wooden frame. A stern-faced man and a tired-looking woman stood beside a younger, unsmiling version of himself. "My parents," he said, his voice raspy. "They worked this land until it broke them. They left me with their debt and the belief that a man's honor is in paying what he owes. Gable's father held the note then. Now he does." He looked at the vast, lonely darkness outside the window. "I never learned how to speak to people, how to be in the world. I just learned how to work. I saw you on that platform and I saw dignity, a person whose character was stronger than their circumstance. I didn't have poetry to offer, only this." He gestured around the bare cabin, the admission costing him more than money ever could. The next morning, the world had changed. The sky was no longer a clear, cold blue, but a bruised, suffocating lid of gray that pressed down on the horizon. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with a silence that felt more menacing than any wind. Thomas came in from the barn, his face grim, stamping snow from his boots that was dry and granular, like sand. "It's coming," he said, his voice low. "A bad one." He began checking the seals on the windows, stuffing rags into any crack that might admit the coming cold. His movements were tight with a familiar anxiety, the muscle memory of a man who has fought the wilderness his entire life and knows he can never truly win. "You should stay inside. Keep the fire high. Once it starts, you don't go out, for anything." It was an order born of fear, a desire to protect the one valuable thing in his life by locking it away. But May had not survived an ocean journey and public abandonment to be sheltered like a porcelain vase. She met his worried gaze with a calm resolve. "The animals will need more water," she stated, not as a question but as a fact. "And you will need food that can be eaten cold if the fire fails." She was already pulling out salted meat and wrapping biscuits in cloth. She was not arguing. She was preparing for a siege, her competence a quiet rebuke to his protective pride. He stopped his work and just stared at her, this woman who saw a coming storm not as a monster to hide from, but as a series of practical problems to be solved. He had to trust her. He had to trust that his partnership was with an equal, not a ward. The first gust of wind hit the cabin like a physical blow, rattling the window panes in their frames. A moment later, the world outside dissolved into a churning, blinding vortex of white. The storm was upon them. The howl of the wind became a constant, living scream, a predator circling the small cabin, testing every wall, every seam. Snow piled in drifts that buried the windows, plunging the interior into a perpetual twilight, lit only by the hungry orange glow of the hearth fire. They existed in a bubble of warmth and light, a tiny island in a raging sea of white oblivion. Hours bled into a day, then a night. They spoke little, conserving energy, their world reduced to the crackle of the fire and the roar of the blizzard. It was in the deepest part of that first night that they heard it, a sharp, violent crack, a sound of wood surrendering to immense pressure, followed by a low groaning from the direction of the barn. Thomas was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of dread. "The north wall," he breathed. "The old beam." That barn and the handful of cattle within it were their entire future, the only weapon they had against Gable and the coming spring payment. To lose it was to lose everything. He grabbed his heavy coat and a lantern, his jaw set. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice raw with urgency. May was already wrapping a thick woolen shawl around her head and pulling on the deerskin boots he had made for her. "That is your future in there," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her stomach. "It is my future too. What do you need me to do?" He looked at her, at the absolute certainty in her eyes, and the last of his instinct to protect her by isolating her vanished. It was replaced by the stark, terrifying need for an ally. There was no time to argue. "Rope," he said, his voice tight. "All of it. And the axe." He opened the door, and the storm lunged inside, a furious blast of ice and wind that stole their breath and tried to claw the light from the lantern. Together they stepped out into the maelstrom. The journey to the barn was a battle for every inch. The wind tore at them, a solid wall of force, and the snow was so thick they could barely see the lantern's light at their own feet. Inside the barn, the chaos was terrifying. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the walls, and the panicked, lowing cattle shifted nervously. A massive roof beam, the main support for the northern side, had splintered near the wall, sagging dangerously under the weight of an immense snowdrift on the roof. It groaned with each new gust, threatening to bring the entire structure down upon them. "We have to brace it," Thomas yelled over the gale, his words nearly ripped away. He pointed to a stack of thick, spare timbers. While he wrestled the heavy wood into position, a desperate attempt to create a new support, he shouted instructions at May. "The rope! We need to anchor the new post to the southern wall. Keep it from kicking out." His plan was raw and desperate, a gamble against the storm's fury. May worked without hesitation, her small, nimble fingers tying the complex knots he needed, knots that would hold under immense strain. She moved with a focused grace, calming the nearest cow with a soft word, weaving the rope through the rafters with a sureness that baffled him. At one critical moment, as Thomas strained to lift the bracing timber, the fractured beam above him gave another sickening crack, showering him with splinters and snow. He stumbled, his strength failing. "It's going!" he gasped. Without a thought, May grabbed the axe, ran to the far end of the new timber, and with a powerful swing, wedged the axe head deep into the frozen earth, creating a crude but effective anchor point that stopped the base from sliding. The timber held. For a breathless second, they both leaned against the new support, chests heaving, the groaning from above lessening to a strained complaint. They had done it. Narrowly, foolishly, they had stared into the teeth of the storm and held it back. They stumbled back into the cabin, collapsing on the floor, dragging the door shut against the howling beast outside. The sudden relative silence was deafening. They were soaked, frozen, and trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. For a long moment they just breathed, their gasps filling the small space. The fire in the hearth was a beacon of life, of impossible safety. Thomas slowly pushed himself up and looked at May. Her hair was laced with snow, her face was numb with cold, but her eyes were bright, fierce, and alive. He saw a deep bleeding scrape on her hand where the rough rope had torn the skin. Gently he took her hand in his calloused thumb brushing away the blood. He led her to the fire, and using a clean cloth and warm water from the kettle, he began to clean the wound. His touch was hesitant, unbelievably tender. "You were," he started, but couldn't find the word. "I was terrified," she confessed in a whisper, her own gaze fixed on their joined hands. "But I was not alone." The simple truth of it settled between them, more profound than any declaration of love. He finished bandaging her hand and didn't let go. He just held it, warming her frozen fingers in his own. "When I saw you at the station," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I asked if you could be my wife forever. It was a desperate question, from a lonely man." He looked up, his shy blue eyes meeting hers directly, holding them. "Now I'm asking again, not because we need to survive, but because I cannot imagine surviving without you." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a warm drop in the cold room. She squeezed his hand, a silent, powerful answer. The contract for a roof and a fire had been fulfilled in the heart of the storm. Everything from this moment on was a choice. It was the foundation of a home. When spring finally came, it was a revelation. The world, once a brutal canvas of white and gray, exploded into 1,000 shades of impossible green. The snow melted, feeding the creeks and revealing the rich, dark earth. The ranch had changed too. The north wall of the barn was rebuilt, stronger than before, with new timbers Thomas had hewn himself. Beside the cabin, a small, meticulously planned garden was taking shape, its neat rows a testament to May's patient, hopeful hands. The partnership that had been forged in winter now blossomed in the sun. News of their survival and of the woman who had helped save the barn had trickled into town. The stares they received were different now, no longer pity or scorn, but a grudging, then a genuine, respect. Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, sent over a jar of apple butter with a neighbor, an unspoken apology and an offering of peace. One afternoon, Thomas came back from town with a small package. It contained not seeds or tools, but 2 simple wedding bands, hammered from polished silver. He didn't make a speech. He simply took her hand, the one he had bandaged in the storm, and slid the ring onto her finger. She did the same for him. That evening they sat together on the porch steps, the hard work of the day done. The air was soft, filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. They watched the sun set, painting the vast sky in strokes of pink and gold. He reached over and took her hand, their fingers lacing together in a gesture that was now as natural as breathing. "It's a good place," he said quietly, looking out over the valley. May leaned her head against his shoulder, a sense of profound, hard-won peace settling over her.